The studio lights were warm. Almost too warm. But no one dared to blink. It wasn't the heat above that made the room feel tight. It was the silence between two men sitting across from each other. Both still. Both waiting for the other to move first. On the left sat Benjamin Netanyahu. Seasoned. Composed. Polished, like a marble statue, carved by decades of global diplomacy. On the right, Ibrahim Traoré. Younger. Resolute. The kind of presence that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it anyway. He wasn't there to perform. He wasn't there to impress. He was there to speak, and the room, the world even, was listening. The moderator offered a soft introduction, her voice steady, but clearly aware of the electricity hanging in the air. Today, she said, we welcome two leaders from two different paths, discussing global cooperation and sustainable leadership in an increasingly divided world. Netanyahu leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled together, gaze unwavering. It's easy to talk about change when you're not the one keeping the system from falling apart, he said. His tone wasn't condescending, at least not overtly, but every word was carefully crafted, as if it had been through rehearsals in a dozen policy rooms before ever leaving his lips. The truth is, those who enjoy the fruits of order rarely understand the burden of maintaining it. Traoré didn't react. Not right away. He let the words hang. Didn't chase them with rebuttal. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, grounded, and deliberate. Then maybe it's time we ask who built that order and who was never invited to the table in the first place. The audience didn't make a sound. This wasn't applause-worthy yet. This wasn't a viral moment. Not yet. But it was the first sign that Traoré wasn't here to play defense. He came to speak truth. Not to power. But in front of it, Netanyahu's expression barely shifted. You're playing with fire. Mr. Traoré, he said, his voice almost fatherly now. With a shade of warning. You think defiance makes you noble. It makes you dangerous. And there it was. The line that had all the weight of authority behind it. The kind of line that stops lesser men in their tracks. But Traoré didn't flinch. Didn't raise an eyebrow. Instead, he leaned forward just enough to close the space between them, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Then he said, clear as day, then stop holding the match. The room paused. Not a cough. Not a shuffle of notes. Not even the moderator's breathing was audible through her microphone. It was as if those 5 words sucked the oxygen out of the space between them. Netanyahu blinked. Just once. The rhythm of his rebuttal thrown off by the sharpness of the reply. It hadn't been loud. It hadn't been dramatic. But it cut. And suddenly, everything changed. You could feel the balance in the room shift, not in favor of domination. Not in favor of anger, but in favor of presence. Traoré wasn't just responding anymore. He was reframing the moment. You've dropped sparks across borders. Traoré continued. Calmly. In places you've never lived. Then called others reckless when the fire spread. Netanyahu tried to reassert control. Israel exists because we act, not because we dream. Traoré nodded. Slowly. And yet, your survival always seems to come at someone else's silence. Again. No applause. Just the kind of tension that makes people sit up straighter. The kind that forces listeners to stop scrolling and actually hear. This wasn't an argument anymore. It was a reckoning. One man was speaking from the podium of legacy. The other, from the heart of lived truth. The moderator interjected lightly, trying to bridge the tension. Let's refocus on collaboration, on where mutual growth is possible. But the room had moved past niceties. Netanyahu, measured but rattled, and spoke again. You talk like the world is yours to correct. Traoré didn't look away. No. I speak like someone who refuses to be corrected for wanting dignity. Silence again. You could almost hear the headlines being written in real time. Netanyahu cleared his throat, searching for the next move. We've kept the world from collapsing into chaos. That takes order. That takes alliances. That takes strength. Traoré voice, calm as before, but sharpened now, replied. Order built on whose silence? On embargoes that choose who eats and who waits. On policies written in offices thousands of miles from the people they affect. For a moment, Netanyahu didn't answer. It wasn't that he didn't have words. It's that the script wasn't working anymore. Traoré wasn't confrontational. He was composed. He wasn't loud. He was clear. And somehow, that made his voice ring louder than any argument. This isn't rebellion, Traoré said. It's restoration. The moderator's eyes bounced between them, unsure whether to steer, pose, or just let the moment unfold. I'm not here to dismantle the world, Traoré said. I'm here to remind it who's been missing from the conversation. Netanyahu finally leaned back. A subtle tell. Traoré wasn't backing down. And he wasn't escalating either. He was simply standing. The crowd behind the cameras didn't clap. They didn't need to. Because they weren't watching a performance. They were witnessing a shift. Two men from two different worlds. One backed by tradition, institutions, and decades of global influence. The other backed by experience, by conviction, and by a generation that's tired of being told to wait their turn. It wasn't about who won. It wasn't about who looked stronger. It was about who spoke in a way the world couldn't ignore anymore. And in that moment, between the glow of studio lights and the silence of global screens, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't challenging power. He was redefining it. And the fire, it wasn't rage. It was clarity. The kind that burns illusions down and leaves only truth behind. By the time the commercial break hit, no one in the control room knew what to say. The crew leaned back from their monitors. Some wide-eyed, others just quietly stunned. It wasn't chaos. It was reverence, the kind of pause that comes not from shock, but from respect. Out on the floor, Netanyahu sat motionless, his shoulders squared but his jaw slightly clenched. Across from him, Ibrahim Traoré hadn't moved an inch. Still grounded, still present, still burning, but never flaring. Backstage, the story had already escaped the studio. Clips of Traoré's response. Then "Stop holding the match" were flooding timelines from Nairobi to New York. News anchors scrambled. Political commentators either praised his poise or warned against reading too much into a moment. But in the eyes of millions watching live, something had already shifted. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Calm, measured, unapologetically human. When they returned to air, the lights came up slowly. The moderator's voice was softer now, her confidence recalibrated by what she'd just witnessed. We'll continue our conversation, she said, with a focus on global cooperation, resource equity, and shared responsibility. Netanyahu cleared his throat. Resetting. There is a reason we value structure. Without it, the loudest voices dominate. Chaos reigns. My country knows this well. We've lived it. We've paid for order. In sweat. In sacrifice. Traoré nodded politely. And so have we. But we weren't invited to write the rules. Netanyahu shifted slightly. You speak as if history is a courtroom. Traoré leaned in. Eyes steady. No. I speak as someone who's walked through places history forgot. There was no venom in his tone. Just weight. Just memory. You speak of sacrifice. Traoré continued. But what of the ones who sacrificed without choosing it? What of the ones who were told to be quiet? To be grateful? While their lands were cleared, their rivers polluted, their stories erased, the moderator tried to step in. Let's be careful not to drift too far from the subject. But Traoré wasn't drifting. He was arriving. I remember a woman in my village. He said, she'd walk 8 miles every morning just to carry clean water to her grandchildren. The same distance every day. No recognition. No microphones. Just survival. Her name won't be in any treaties. But her story is why I'm sitting here. Netanyahu raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. You see? Traoré said. When you come from places where dignity is a luxury, you learn to hear what others overlook. You learn that silence isn't peace. It's exhaustion. The studio hushed again. The kind of hush that demands you lean forward, not back. Netanyahu responded, his voice more tempered now. With all due respect, I understand hardship. I understand sacrifice. But leadership means more than remembering the past. It means protecting the present. And what is protection? Traoré asked gently. If it comes at the cost of someone else's breath, for a moment. Even the camera operators stopped adjusting their angles. Because that question, quiet, unassuming, carried the weight of everyone who's ever been talked over. You say structure brings peace. Traoré continued. But peace for whom? For the architect, or for the ones beneath the scaffold, for the boardroom, or for the village, for the diplomat, or for the grandmother with no water? He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't have to. Netanyahu sat back, arms crossed, composing himself. Idealism is noble. But the world is not built on ideals. It's built on action. Exactly. Traoré said, not missing a beat. And I've been on the ground building, with calloused hands, with real people, not in think tanks, not with simulations, with cement and sweat. And I've learned this. People don't need pity. They need a seat. Not at your table. At their own. The moderator took a deep breath. This wasn't debate. This was testimony. You talk about global cooperation. Traoré added. But cooperation isn't giving with one hand and taking with the other. It's not aid tied to conditions. It's not praise in daylight and pressure at night. Now Netanyahu sat still. The usual cues of defense interruption, redirection weren't coming. Perhaps because he saw it too. That this wasn't a man attacking him. It was a man asking to be seen. When people like me speak, Traoré said, we're not being rebellious. We're being remembered. The moderator cleared her throat, attempting to ease the weight. Mr. Traoré, there are those who might say your words, while powerful, lack the technical precision that global leadership requires. That passion doesn't always equal policy. Traoré turned to her, not with frustration, but with clarity. That's because policy, too often, is written without proximity, and passion without purpose is noise. But passion rooted in truth, that's leadership. Netanyahu rubbed his brow, not out of disdain, but out of something else, reflection, perhaps, or realization. I'm not here to burn bridges, Traoré said. I'm here because people back home can't afford to wait for someone else to speak for them. The studio lights felt brighter now. Or maybe it was the way Traoré's voice seemed to carry them. This isn't about guilt. It's about honesty. It's about acknowledging that for all our talks of progress, too many are still left in the shadows. He paused, letting the silence carry his point. You say I speak with too much emotion. He continued, but tell me, how else should I speak? When the people I represent are still waiting for clean water, for safe schools, for a voice that isn't filtered through translation. There was no anger in him, only conviction. I don't want charity, he said. I want fairness. I want the dignity of standing beside others, not below them. The moderator looked to Netanyahu, hoping he might respond. Netanyahu leaned forward, voice softer. If what you're asking for is respect, I hear you. Traoré nodded. It's a start. And, for a brief second, something rare happened. Not agreement, not alliance, but space. A space where both could exist without one having to shrink. A space where power didn't have to mean silence for the other. As the segment wound down, the audience in the studio didn't applaud. They just sat there, still, as if watching something they didn't want to disturb. Because this wasn't a clash. It was a conversation, and in that conversation, Ibrahim Traoré didn't raise his fist. He raised his voice. And somehow that was louder. By the time the final segment began, the world wasn't just watching. It was leaning in. Something about the stillness in that studio had spilled into living rooms, classrooms, offices, cafes. This wasn't a spectacle anymore. It had become something else. A moment. Not loud. Not viral in the usual way, but undeniably real. The moderator didn't open with another grand statement. Her voice was softer now, tempered by what had unfolded. We'll begin this final round with closing reflections, she said. No interruptions. Just your thoughts. What have we learned from each other? There was a long pause. Netanyahu adjusted his posture, not to look powerful, but to look honest. For the first time, his gaze wasn't aimed to dominate, it was steady, almost reflective. I've been in rooms like this for most of my life, he began. I've sat across from world leaders, critics, allies, adversaries. But tonight, something feels different. His voice held the cadence of a man used to control, but it trembled slightly with sincerity. Maybe it's the questions. Maybe it's what I've had to face in myself. He turned slightly toward Traoré, and what he said next surprised even his closest aides. You speak of forgotten people. I may not fully understand that experience, but I acknowledge it. I don't agree with everything you've said, but I respect that you said it without anger. That matters more than you think. Traoré nodded once. Not in victory, not in approval, but in recognition. Then came his turn. He didn't look into the camera. He looked around the room. at the floor, at the lights, at the table. Then finally, he looked at the moderator and softly said, "You asked what we learned from each other. I think we learned what happens when people actually listen." He leaned forward slightly. "When I was growing up, my mother used to say, the loudest voice in the room is not always the one speaking. I never truly understood that until I saw entire nations go unheard. Until I saw decisions made for us, without us. Until I saw pain translated into statistics." The crowd was still. "I am not here to pretend that I have all the answers. I don't. But I do know what it feels like to be spoken about, but never spoken to. I know what it feels like when your truth is considered inconvenient, and I know how dangerous silence can become when it's mistaken for consent." He paused, just long enough to make space for the truth to settle in. "Tonight, I've been told that I'm emotional, that I speak from memory, not from data. Maybe that's true, but tell me, what good is data without context? What good is order if it forgets the people it claims to protect?" The moderator shifted in her chair, but didn't interrupt. "Leadership," Traoré said, "isn't just about defending the system. It's about being brave enough to fix what's broken, even when you didn't break it." He turned directly to Netanyahu. "You said you've lived through conflict. So have we. But our wounds don't always bleed on camera. Sometimes they're invisible, hidden in hunger, in unemployment, in the quiet dignity of people waiting for change." Netanyahu didn't respond. He just listened. And maybe for the first time in a long time, that was enough. "I'm not asking to be agreed with," Traoré said. "I'm asking for acknowledgement that our lives matter not only when they serve someone else's interests. That peace isn't something handed down. It's something built, hand in hand." He looked to the audience, then to the moderator. "You asked what this conversation is about. It's not about policy. Not really. It's about proximity. You can't care about people you never sit beside. You can't hear stories you never asked to be told." The silence in the room was alive now. Electric. Not heavy with tension, but charged with awakening. He stood. No defiance. No dramatics. Just quiet strength. "People like me," he said, "we've been told to wait our turn, to earn our place, to be grateful. But gratitude without justice is just obedience dressed politely." He looked across the stage. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm just asking that the world stop overlooking everyone." The moderator, nearly whispering now, asked, "If you could leave us with one lesson tonight, what would it be?" Traoré smiled gently. It wasn't smug. It wasn't triumphant. It was almost hopeful. "I'd say this," he said. "When you speak, speak from a place that can't be shaken by applause or silence. Speak as if no one will remember your name, but they will remember how you made them feel. Because the world doesn't need louder voices. It needs truer ones." There it was. The lesson, not packaged in outrage, not carved out of ideology, just truth, wrapped in humility. And then he sat back down. No slogans, no theatrics, just a man who had stood, spoken, and returned to stillness. The moderator didn't close with a flashy statement. She simply said, "Thank you." And as the cameras slowly zoomed out, the two men remained seated, not as combatants, not as enemies, not even as rivals, but as two voices that, for one night, occupied the same space with nothing but truth between them. And that was enough to change something. Maybe not everything, but something. Somewhere. Someone sat on their couch, a student, a teacher, a mother, a worker, and realized they weren't alone in the questions they had been afraid to ask. And that, perhaps, is how the world changes. Not with noise, but with listening